Well, hello. I'm Mrs. Clifford Snell, and I live in Malden, Massachusetts, but I'm here in Searsport visiting my brother's family. He's away at sea. He's a sea captain. But I intended to come last summer, and I had great plans, but then the tragedy happened, and so I didn't make it. You may have heard about that. It was in all the newspapers last summer because it was a story about a barkentine that was smashed by a very large Navy destroyer off Cape Cod. And it made all the newspapers, and it was even as far away as South Carolina. I saw a record of it. But it was very much big news last year, but of course, you know how news fades, and pretty soon nobody remembers, but I certainly do. And it still bothers me, and I can tell you about it if you're interested. You see, my brother and I are with the children of William and Fidelia Dutch Myers, and my father was born in England, and he was a sea captain, and sailed very successfully. And so in 1891. He had enough backers and enough money of his own to be able to have a ship built. Actually, it was a barkentine built here in Searsport. He hired his uncle, Josiah Dutch, to build it for him. And incidentally, it was the last of the large ships to be built in Searsport. But anyway, when he built the ship, because he was the major owner, he had a chance it was his duty to name the vessel. And he chose to name it after me, Mabel Isidore Meyer. And it's called the Mabel I. Meyer. I was 20 at the time, and lots of young women have the experience of having ships named for them. It's pretty common, you know, you name it for your sister or your mother or whatever. But I was still very pleased that my father did that. And I was even more pleased when it stayed in the family, and my brother Clarence, started sailing it as the master in 1900, and he sailed it, well, right till the end. And the end it was. What happened was the barkentine and was sailing around Cape Cod. She had left Barbados and was on her way with a load of molasses from, and she was heading for Boston and then for Portland, but she never made it. As she was rounding Cape Cod in a very thick fog, she heard a whistle, and my brother heard a whistle, but it was too late, and the very large destroyer smashed right into the bow of the poor little Mabel. And she took on water, and she sank right there, woof, down. We were all saved. All the people aboard, not me, I wasn't there, but all the people aboard were saved. They were taken aboard the ship, the Nebraska, and were taken to Boston. And that was, it was hard for my family. I think that I'm glad that my father was not alive to know that he'd lost his ship that was 24 years old and had been sailing all that time. And for me it was hard because she was my namesake, and so I always felt kind of connected to her in a way that I wasn't so connected with other ships my father had sailed on. But in the end, it wasn't a great loss, because in the end the government paid my family, who mostly owned the ship, $81,000, which was for the loss of both the vessel and its cargo. So in the end, the Mabel was an old ship. She wasn't going to be sailing much longer anyway, and so we did end up with some money to help us. But still, it's still sad, and I obviously still worry about it, because I still want to talk about what happened to my namesake ship. the barkentine Mabel I. Myers.
Read all about it. Captain Eggett of the Yankee ship Charles Dennis just arrived in Rio de Janeiro, where he and his crew were landed by the American ship Belle of Bath after they floundered off Cape Horn on September 5th, 1891. The Dennis left New York for San Francisco with a cargo of coal on June 6th. On August 10th, she ran into the first wild weather of her voyage. She sprang a leak and filled with so much water that it was impossible to get to the engine to start the pumps. The seas were calmed somewhat by pouring oil on the waves, and they were able to start the pumps. By then, there was 6 feet of water in the hold. It took 12 hours to get it out. The weather cleared and they sailed for 2 more months just fine, until on August 31st, the barometer indicated the approach of a cyclone. Sail was shortened not a moment too soon. The blast of the cyclone carried away the topsail yard, which fell and struck the forestay and split the foresail. All hands were called on deck as the storm turned even more violent. The sails flapped back and forth, and sea after sea broke over the ship's bows. 5 men were disabled in the chaos. One had both his arms broken from being swept against the bulwarks and deckhouse. Captain Eggett mustered the crew aft for safety, but then the seas burst off the hatches and flooded the hold. The fury of the hurricane was done with its torment by daybreak, but the waves never ceased. Later that day, the crew came aft and asked the skipper to make for the nearest port. They did not believe that she would weather another storm. The water was gaining on the pumps and the men just couldn't keep up, and for once, the skipper listened to his men, and soon the ship was headed for Port Stanley. On September 5th, the skipper called the men aft and announced that the condition of the ship was so bad that she could not be kept afloat for more than a few days, and their only hope of salvation would be to keep in the course of sailing vessels and hope she would be spotted. A day later, the Yankee clipper Belle of Bath was sighted. Signals of distress were run up, and the Belle of Bath bore down on the Dennis. The Belle of Bath was run by Captain Curtis of our very own Searsport. He was quite the honorable man, and not many would have done what he did next. The waves were so lofty and the wind was so high that the ships feared to draw near each other. Captain Curtis shouted to his countrymen that he would stand by them until the sea abated, and if necessary, would take the men off. But the Dennis was in peril of going down. Her deck was nearly flush with the sea when the first mate and 6 seamen, including the one who had both his arms broken, tried to launch a boat. They got into the water and were starting towards the Belle of Bath when a wave struck the boat, smashing the gunwale, and drove it across the Dennis's side, knocking a hole in its stern. But the 7 men managed to reach the Belle of Bath and were dragged aboard. Captain Curtis called for volunteers to rescue the rest of the crew of the Dennis, which was settling in the water fast as the seas broke over her constantly. 4 men stepped forth. They launched a lifeboat and rowed within 500 feet of the sinking ship. One of them stood in the bow and cast a line towards the Dennis. A seaman grasped it, tied around his waist, and jumped into the sea. He was dragged aboard the boat. 7 men were all taken off in this manner. But it was a slow process, and night had set in, and the Belle of Bath had drifted out of sight of the rescue boat. She was fully a mile away when the weary rescuers started to pull in her direction, which they could only see due to the blue burning lights on her deck. However, the lights stopped to burn, and Captain Eggett and his men on the Dennis began to fear that they would never see the gallant ship again. The Dennis was completely unmanageable. All hands that were still left on board went to the pumps and worked until daylight. Then they all scanned the horizon, hoping to see the Belle of Bath. No sail was visible, but despair soon gave way to joy and then half delirious laughter when at 7 o'clock the topsails of a ship were spotted on the southern horizon. Gradually the ship materialized and she bore down on the storm-battered Yankee derelict. The ship was the Belle of Bath. She had returned for them. A man had been aloft on her since dawn, anxiously looking for the Dennis. Captain Curtis thought that she had gone down in the night, but he was determined to cruise around for at least a day to make sure he didn't leave anyone stranded if he could help it. Some of the Dennis's own crew helped to man the boat that left the Belle of Bath, eager to return for their shipmates, but they were so fearful that the Dennis would sink and swamp the boat that her crew dared not go within 100 feet of her. Captain Eggett and his man had to jump into the sea and trust that they would be picked up by the boat, and they were all rescued. The captain was the last man to leave the ship, which went down bow first. Captain Eggett and his men lost everything except the clothes they stood in, but they all survived with their lives, thanks to a Searsport captain.
Where have you been? What have you and those Mason friends of yours been doing on your little excursion home from Sedgwick?
Well, we left and we got onto the Palm, our steamship, and you wouldn't believe it, but we nearly shipwrecked 3 times on the ledges below Mark Island coming across and into approaching Rockland Harbor.
Really?
We left we worked on all these documents that we were working on for the council, the decrees. And then after we'd been doing that all evening, we finally, all 43 of us got on aboard about midnight. So we started out the Egmonton Reach and we came around Pumpkin Island and we started across the bay. And everything was going fine, and then about 2 o'clock in the morning, that gale that was last night, that had all the thunder and lightning, well, it hit us, and the seas and the winds blew up so bad that Captain Butworth got all off course, and he hit the ledges down below Mark Island as we came in. And so a couple of the guys got off because we crashed onto the ledge and settled in, and they jumped off aboard and onto the ledge. And then a couple other of them jumped into the drink with their life vests on. Well, we threw them the gangplank because they don't swim so good. And then we, all of a sudden, the crew is now pumping like mad trying to get the bilge clear of all that seawater that was coming in from all those damages. And we went afloat, and then we came off the ledge, but we tried to stay in there close so that we could get them back on the boat. Well, we hit a second ledge and crashed onto it.
Mercy.
Well, the next thing that happens is we get off that ledge somehow, and then we have to go back up to try and get the guys, and we worked.
Did you get them all?
Well, we dropped the lifeboat, and then it capsized. And after it capsizes, now we have another couple hours with just the lightning giving us some light. And fortunately, it was flashing up there, and we could see a little bit, and we finally got everybody aboard. But poor Ed Maxey, he was all unconscious when we got him aboard. And then we loaded up, we got them all loaded, and then we headed back. Well, they hit a third ledge, and then we're up aground a hard. I mean, really a hard. And so we're stuck there.
So what'd you do then?
Well, I didn't do anything except, say this is a mess. But our fellow mason, William Williams, he went up and helped Captain Butworth, and the two of them managed to get us off the final ledge as the tide rose, so I think it helped us.
That was lucky.
And then, the crew's still pumping like mad, so we made for Rockland Harbor and hoped we were going to hit anything else, and they're pumping and we're just limping along, damaged and battered, and half the guys that got bandaged and need bandages and looking like a mess. And then we finally got in the harbor and we got into the dock about 6 o'clock.
Well, that was an hour ago.
Well, yes, but then I stayed dockside, made sure that everybody who was coming off the boat was going to be able to be taken care of at the infirmary if they'd been medically injured so badly, or at least we could bandage them up and send them home on their way. So when everybody was cleared, then I stumbled up here, and now you see me, and boy, am I cold and exhausted.
Well, dear, have a cup of coffee. I'm glad you made it home safely.
Thank you.
So I'm reading my scrapbook of my first 6 months of life, and my father wrote me up a birth certificate later and put the place on my chart. Oh, but you're here to hear about my story. So when I was just 7 months old, I was born on the ship Hope. My name is Hope Curtis, so my namesake ship. We were sailing from the Pacific Northwest with a cargo of lumber for Valparaiso, and we hit a typhoon, a cyclone, and the newspaper recorded it because the ship dismasted, and luckily we had that cargo of timber, so Papa put up the jury-rig mast and sailed us into Honolulu. And so that's in one newspaper. And then there's this testimonial from the officers of the USS Alaska telling the story, but then they say, Captain Curtis gave striking proof of his ability, pluck, and resolution in surmounting the difficulties that beset him. So proud of Papa. But he sold the ship, and it says here that Captain Curtis of the ship Hope, which came to this port under jury-rig masts, left for San Francisco by the Suez with his wife and child. That's me, the child, the little baby. And then here in the local paper, it says that Captain Curtis sold the ship in Honolulu. So that was the end of my namesake. A good ship I was born on, but didn't do so well.
This is the story of the sail and steamship Georgia, who was originally built in 1862 as the Japan in Dunbarton, Scotland. She sailed under the English flag for a little bit and then was sold to the Confederate States of America. And she sailed for them until the U.S. overpowered and took custody of her when she had been named by the Confederate States as the Georgia. And that was the name that she carried into her sudden demise. So she later, after she was run for a short period of time by the United States, she was taken over by a Canadian steamship company, and her last voyage was intended to be from Halifax, Nova Scotia, down to Portland, Maine. She was carrying a light cargo. The information available did not specify what the cargo was. She had 12 passengers on board, but was big enough to carry quite a number more, but on this voyage only 12, and a crew of 47 because she still used sails and needed the extra manpower to raise and lower and do various things with the sails. She was coming down on the southern part of Penobscot Bay, and the accounts are somewhat confused. Crew members said they were in the middle of a snowstorm and couldn't see where they were going. One of the passengers said it was actually a bright night when you could see the stars. I don't know if that means that the crew was trying to cover up for mistaking where they were and which way they were going, but it appears they confused Matinicus and Whitehead Island, got off course, and went soundly ashore on a group of rocks called the Triangles. And if you're wondering where the Triangles are, if you were to draw a line from Matinicus to Tennant's Harbor, you'll have to look that up yourself later. The Triangle sits in that line, and she crashed on there. Now this was in January 5th actually, of 1875, so as you can imagine, it was quite cold that night. And when they tried to put the lifeboats over, they had quite a time because they were all encased in ice. The first boat went over, but not successfully, and sank because of the gear that drops the boat busted up but they got quite a few of the people into the boats and got to shore in various places, Tennant's Harbor, and one of them was trying to get a tugboat to go up the following morning to get more passengers. Some of the crew and some of the passengers got into one lifeboat, and there was kind of a confusing story, but surprisingly, in the middle of a winter night, there were no souls lost in the accident. All of the crew and all of the passengers survived, and but the ship itself, the Georgia, was considered to be a total loss, as was the cargo.
Not one of them reporters, are you? Name's Clark, O.M. Clark, formerly steward of the St. Mary's, and I want to put the record straight. We did not struck by the Magellan. No? Well, you don't know the story? Well, I was steward aboard the St. Mary's, poor Captain Carver, and we were going around the Horn to Valparaiso, And about 250 miles west of the Horn one night, we were running under small sail, and wind had been picked up and hadn't been able to shake out the reefs yet. And look out on the forecastle head, sees another ship coming. And she was running free, so we had the right of way, so we held our course as we should. And it got closer, and there were a big British bark, painted ports along the side. And the lookout, he got a lantern, started waving it, telling the fellow to bear off, bear off. And he finally started to, but too late. She struck us in the stern, carried away the mizzen topmast, carried away the mizzen chains, and left part of our anchor on our quarterdeck, and then bore off into the night without so much as a how do you do. Well, Captain Carver decided we was too badly hurt to carry on to Valparaiso, so we turned around and ran for the Falklands. And then, as luck would have it, well, bad luck would have it, we were on our way, getting close, and the carpenter, who was stepping in for the second mate, who was feeling poorly, saw breakers and reported to the mate and went below, and the mate didn't hear him or didn't care, because about an hour later we run hard aground, and I reckon that about did it for poor Captain Carver. You know, the ship was aground and lost, and we got in the boats. He said he'd stay, make sure the ship was safe, so no one claimed it for salvage. And a couple days later, got back, and poor Captain Carver was dead. Now, some folks are saying he committed suicide, but that's not true. He had a heart attack, or just died of exhaustion or overwork. But anyway, some German skippers claiming that we told them that we hit the Magellan. Now, Magellan went missing about the same time, but it wasn't the Magellan that hit us, because she was an American ship, never had painted ports nohow. And then Dunbar Rock, British ship, come in, reporting collision, and I think it was her that hit us. But Captain of the Dunbar Rock's being very close-mouthed about it. So, anyway, ready here to set the record straight. That's my story.
Hi, I'm Madeline Thurston. You will never guess what happened last night. It was just me and my mother and my father and my brother and the other crew member on my father's ship, the Herman F. Kimball. We were on our way up from Boston back to Searsport. We had a phosphate or something like that, and then just as we were passing Boone Island, boom, the ship starts taking on water. Now the bulkhead kept like most of it from getting into most of the ship, but the phosphate was clogging up the pumps, so we had to bail it out by hand with plain old buckets. I mean, I wasn't worried for a second. I knew my father was going to be able to handle it just fine, but well, he needed all hands on deck to help with the bailing out, and so he couldn't steer, and so my mother started steering the ship, and she was amazing. She steered us all the way into shore until we could find somebody and hail them, and then they got the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard came out, and we all got off okay. Everybody said she was amazing, as good as any skipper they'd ever seen, and I helped.
Good evening. I'm Mrs. Martha Merrithew. My husband is Captain Jeremiah A. Merrithew, and he is the son of also Captain Jeremiah Merrithew, who built this house in 1864. Are you from hereabouts, or are you summer folk? Ah, if you're from around here, you probably heard about the sea serpent. Did you see the article just a year or two ago in 1899 that reported the sighting of a sea serpent that was seen off the coast here? Its body was so long that the extent could not be seen all the way underwater. Its tail was just 15 feet from the ship, and as it swished the tail, foam formed. It had a head that was gigantic, very similar to a horse, that actually had a mouth on a protuberance in the center of its body. Now, there have been many sightings over the years of sea serpents off the Maine coast and the New England coast, and there have been many, many articles in magazines and newspapers from as far away as Topeka, Kansas. Guests at our local coastal hotels and boarding houses are telling They're hosts that many times they're coming in hopes of seeing a sea serpent. Bangor Daily News at one point reported that the sea serpents appear every summer. And another article in another newspaper back in the 1870s referred to a convention of sea serpents offshore here. So maybe the sea serpents are coming to entice more visitors. Now, my husband, the captain, knows a number of other ship captains who have claimed that they have seen sea serpents. Even on Penobscot Bay, sea serpents have been reported from the 1600s off the coast of New England, all the way from Eastport down to Cape Cod. Off the coast of Mount Desert Island, Mount Desert Rock, off the Cranberry Isles, as I said before, Penobscot Bay, Booth Bay, Portland Harbor, Casco Bay, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and there were scores of sightings off the coast of northern Massachusetts at one point. So one of the earliest recorded sightings of a sea serpent was in 1778. A Mr. Ebenezer Crabtree, said to be of unimpeachable veracity, lived on an island out in Penobscot Bay. He claimed one morning he got up, went out on the beach, and saw a creature that was 500 feet long, with a huge head, with intense eyes, a black mouth, and fins that looked like wings. He tried to get closer to it, but as he approached, it slithered off the beach and into the water. 15 years later, another Mr. Crabtree, perhaps the same man, perhaps another, reported another account of a sighting of a sea serpent. This time it was, well, let me read what he wrote about it. It was published in the National Gazette. He writes, on the 20th last, being on my passage from the West Indies in the morning, having just made Mount Desert Island, distant nearly 10 leagues, I suddenly got sight of a serpent of an enormous size, swimming on the surface of the ocean, its head elevated about 6 or 8 feet out of the water, rather prone forward. That part of the body which was out of the water I judged to be about the size of a barrel in circumference, but the head larger, having some resemblance to a horse head. According to the most accurate computation, which I made in my mind, of his length, I think it could not be less than from 55 to 60 feet, perhaps longer. That part of the body which was not elevated, but which I had a distinct view of several times, was larger than that part of the water, body of a dark brown. I was within 200 yards of it near an hour, during which time it discovered no inclination to molest us. Myself and the whole crew observed it with the minutest attention, nor was its attention less fixed on us. The eye was perfectly black, sharp, and piercing. I was so near it as to observe clearly that there were no fins or external appendages to the body, but that its motion was by the writhing of the body, like other serpents. Actually, I have some illustrations from magazines and newspapers here of sea serpents, so you might like to look at those. Perhaps you've been out down on the shore with your spyglass to look out and see if you can see one. I take mine down whenever I hear when there's one in the area, but I don't really know what to believe. In, I think it was 1875, there was a sea serpent observed twice in one day in July. A yachting party, as well as the captain and a passenger on a steamship, saw a huge black and white creature with a body probably 100 feet long. And then within days, in August, the crew of a passenger ship also observed another sea creature, but this one was coiled around the carcass of a whale. So, I don't know what you think, but what would you do if you were on board a ship and saw a sea serpent off the side? Well, one sailor is said to have jumped into his longboat, rowed out to the creature, and fired a shot at its head as it reared up out of the water. Another captain chased one for 12 miles. So, there is some reason to believe there might be sea serpents, plenty of reason to believe that there's not. There was a minister some years back, Reverend Mr. McLean, who wrote a very detailed description of the creature that he saw. He was a man of high repute, and therefore we must expect credibility. And his description, his report, is actually in the Boston Public Library. So, sea serpents are certainly subjects that can cause excitement and wonder. And there are many reasons people enjoy summer in Maine. And for some of them, I guess the possibility of glimpsing a sea serpent is one of them.